Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. In this, our first episode of 2025, we celebrate the new year in the best way possible. First of all, we have a giant party. Then we armor up and fight the good fight. Then we build a better peace as we discuss chapters 10 to 15, the last third, more or less, of C.S. Lewis's Narnian sequel, Prince Caspian, part of the Narniad. Have you heard the word Narniad? I confess I had not heard the word Narniad until this week. I was flipping through Paul Ford's excellent companion to Narnia. I think I mentioned this back in the unit on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is basically a very comprehensive and well-researched glossary of every possible thing that you can find in the Narniad, in the Narnian books. And I found there an account, I want to get this title right because it is so wonderful, an account of a 1977 volume entitled The Renaissance of Wonder in Children's Literature by the Scottish writer and academic Marion Cleland Lochhead, in which she describes the Chronicles of Narnia as the Narniad. So I'm going to be adopting that right now. I'm going to link to both of those in the show notes, of course, so you can go and peruse those volumes on your own time. But tonight, we move forward in our discussion of the Narniad by concluding Prince Caspian and really getting to grips with some of the most interesting interpretive material that we've had thus far, I think. Here in these closing chapters of Prince Caspian, Lewis not only expands on the taxonomy of Narnian creatures, which we began to understand last week, and slots them very usefully into a kind of meaningful hierarchy. Not a hierarchy that I think will come as a huge surprise to us, but a hierarchy nonetheless. But we're also going to get one of the most clear and surprising moral compasses that this series will give us. What is good in Narnia? Well, tonight we're going to get a really compelling argument about an unexpected virtue and certainly an unexpected vice. More on that as we move forward. We have to be brisk tonight because we've got a lot of ground to cover, but we absolutely have to begin with some timeline material because I received this week a positive flurry of emails from people who are, to a greater or lesser extent, having trouble keeping up with the timeline of Narnia as a whole and the timeline of Prince Caspian specifically. So, 2 quick slides to lay out the timeline as we understand it. Some of this is going to break slightly our understanding of the timeline based just on the books that we've covered so far, but this is all canonical material. Some of this is taken from Lewis's expanded work too. Let's take a quick look at this first slide. This is the Narnian calendar, or at least the relevant years of the Narnian calendar as we understand it. NY here for Narnian year. In the year 1000, a nice round number there, the Pevensey children first arrive in Narnia at the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Therefore, in 1015 NY, the kings and queens of Narnia return to Earth. That is the point at which the Golden Age ends and the Dark Age of Narnia begins, as will be accounted in other volumes in the series, as will be suggested in other sources. This is a long, slow process of declination, right? It's not a coincidence that it is referred to as the Dark Age, right? It is mimicking the Dark Age of Western Europe here. The light has gone out and the world is slipping toward darkness. That lasts for the better part of 1,000 years because in the year 1998, and I find it difficult to really comprehend the invasion of the Telmarines into Narnia without thinking about, but what if it had actually happened in 1998? What if Caspian the First of Narnia has like frosted tips and a pleather jacket, right? I think that this is a compelling visual, and I encourage you all to go and make fan art. Either way, in the year 1998 of the Narnian calendar, the Telmarines invade Narnia following, as we learn at the end of today's reading, a famine in Telmar. Caspian the First is crowned, and the Telmarine age begins. So this is 300 years, which is helpful because I think that one of the things that was tripping people up was this idea that the Telmarines had been resident in Narnia for 1,000 years or 1,300 years, and how could the line of kings only have run from Caspian the First to Caspian the 10th? And the answer is, well, it's 300 years, and a generation is roughly 30 years, and it's very strict and mechanical. We're absolutely following a normal human lifespan in Narnia, which is important because the Telmarines are not different from the humans of Earth. They are, as we see tonight, at the end of tonight's reading, they are sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, just as the Pevensey children are, crucially, right? There's no distinction between the two groups. Caspian is every bit as entitled to rule Narnia as Peter the High King. We'll get to all of that in due course. Therefore, in 2290 of the Narnian calendar, Caspian X is born. His father, that same year, King Caspian IX, is murdered by Miraz, his brother Miraz, of course, thus Uncle Miraz. And then in 2303 of the Narnian calendar, Caspian blows Queen Susan's horn and summons the Pevensey children into Narnia. Can we be more precise, though, about the events of this book? We can to some extent. And we can do so by leveraging the single solitary date that we get in the whole Narniad, right? We get one Narnian date provided to us, and it's in the challenge that the High King Peter sends to Miraz in tonight's reading, which we're going to discuss in due course. But we're going to pull the date from that and backfill to provide a useful kind of temporal schematic to lay out the events of this book, which begin, therefore, on the 8th of Greenroof, right? This is the ruinous attack by Caspian on Miraz's army. This is when everything goes wrong, everyone is wounded. It becomes clear that this guerrilla war or series of skirmishes that Caspian is leading against Miraz's forces are not in fact going to work out. We can't be certain of the dates before that because the narrative voice simply skips over periods of time, right? It will jump ahead rather than keeping a chronicle of days. The narrative voice will then say, and then the next thing that happened was X, and we don't really know for sure how many days have passed in between. But we do know the first date, working backwards from the 12th, the first date is the 8th of Greenroof, this magical month in Narnian in the Narnian calendar, right? So on the 8th, we have this attack on Miraz's army. It becomes clear that Caspian's plan, such as it is untenable. On the 9th, we get Trumpkin departing from Aslan's How, and Caspian blows the horn that morning between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. following the attack by Miraz, which I have to say, for all the times that I've read this book, was a detail that I had just never caught with. It had never stuck with me that there is, in fact, last week I had this harmless speculation about solar archways carved into Aslan's How, just as an excuse for why it is that Caspian doesn't blow the horn until later. I had acknowledged that was a problem, that was a gap in the narrative, but for some reason the explanation just had not stuck with me. It's weird, the things that catch our attention on the 4th or 5th or 6th read through a novel, but certainly that was one that escaped my attention until this time through. So this is the 9th. The horn is blown. The Pevensey children arrive in Narnia and discover the ruins of Cair Paravel. Then the 10th, the children rescue Trumpkin. This is the following day. This is Susan wielding her powerful archery skills, rescuing Trumpkin. He then tells them the whole story, that large 4-chapter chunk of flashback. They arm themselves, they play with Trumpkin, right? They duel Trumpkin, Edmund duels Trumpkin, and then Susan demonstrates her archery skill once again. They arrive at Glasswater late in that day. Lucy stays awake and then goes into the trees. This is basically taking us up to where we are now in the reading. The 11th, they travel on foot. This is the first time that Lucy sees Aslan, but we spend the day instead taking this long detour down into the gorge toward the bridge that will become a ford once again as we continue through this restoration fantasy, and back again. That night, Lucy has her first real conversation with Aslan and then wakes the others. They decide to follow Aslan's lead. They leave in the middle of the night, and then on the 12th at dawn, they arrive at Aslan's How. This is where we have the romp that will come forth in tonight's reading. Peter and Edmund go into the How. They rescue Caspian. Peter challenges Miraz to single combat. We have the duel on that same day, and then the battle on that same day, and then the feast on that same day. The 12th of Greenroof, a very busy day in Narnia. On the 13th, we get the note that messengers are sent forth to summon all the Talmarines in Narnia, which they can do in 5 days, right? They say you have to come by noon on the 5th day, which they do, and that is when Caspian is crowned. The Talmarines leave Narnia, some of them leave Narnia at least, and the Pevensey children return home. And I bring this up in part because we're going to have a conversation in tonight's reading about eucatastrophe, really, right? We're going to have a conversation about Aslan's insertion into the children's journey across Narnia and what it accomplishes and what it might have accomplished under better or worse circumstances. So we're going to talk about that. So I do want to have, this isn't just clarifying for the listener at home. It is also a purposeful bit of framing to allow for a more meaningful discussion later as we get into it. Oh, I also got, because I'm seeing here the word Pevensey right here in front of me, I also got an email this week from Peter, who took pains to assure me that he is not the High King in secret. So thank you for that, Peter, to ask about the name Pevensey and where it comes from, because I've been using it very freely. I did mention this too, I think, back in our unit on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but I don't think I've mentioned it in this series at all. The word Pevensey comes from The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It comes, I think, from the first page of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Eustace describes his dislike for his cousins, the Pevensey kids, referring to Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. And it's just useful because he is, a cousin and therefore not a Pevensey in quite the same way. So I've backfilled it. I made the decision back in the unit on the first book to backfill that name and just use it because it's a very flexible piece of shorthand to distinguish, particularly as we must now, between the Pevensey children themselves and other human beings who have come into Narnia. With all of that said, then thank you for your email, Peter. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who wrote with questions and clarification about the timeline. I think I responded to you all directly. If I didn't, please let me know, and I will. But hopefully these slides have provided a little extra clarity about what is going on in the Narnian calendar. With all that said, then, let's get into our reading from tonight with Chapter 10. We're going to spend a little bit of time on Chapter 10 and then kind of accelerate through the back half of the book, or the back third of the book, which is largely what C.S. Lewis does too. Let's get started with the rush. They may have been wise to stick to the rush instead of going along the top. It kept them sure of their direction, and ever since the fir wood, they had all been afraid of being forced too far out of their course and losing themselves in the wood. It was an old and pathless forest, and you could not keep anything like a straight course in it. Patches of hopeless brambles, fallen trees, boggy places, and dense undergrowth would always be getting in your way. But the gorge of the Rush was not at all a nice place for travelling either. I mean, it was not a nice place for people in a hurry. For an afternoon's ramble ending in a picnic tea, it would have been delightful. It had everything you could want of an occasion of that sort. Rumbling waterfalls, silver cascades, deep amber-coloured pools, mossy rocks, and deep moss on the banks in which you could sink over your ankles. Every kind of fern, jewel-like dragonflies, sometimes a hawk overhead, and once, Peter and Trumpkin both thought, an eagle. But of course, what the children and the dwarf wanted to see as soon as possible was the great river below them, and Baruna, and the way to Aslan's How. So we're really pulling out the distinction here between, well, two different pairs of things, right? Narnia as was and Narnia as is, and the Narniad as was and the Narniad as is, because as we discussed a little last week, the geography of Narnia in the first book is harmless to the point of transparency, right? We never really have to worry about getting from one place to another. It is open and accessible, and the only things that are important are the specific locations where action will occur. That's much less true of this book. This is a much more conventional, 20th century fantasy narrative. We love our quests. We love traveling in fantasy narratives, and that's really strangely kind of a fixture of, to some extent, the post-Tolkienian world, of course, right? Both The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, are anchored in these truly epic quests where the geography matters a great deal. Of course, Prince Caspian comes out before The Lord of the Rings, which is vitally important if we're to understand the significance of the trees coming to life, too, later in tonight's reading, a small tease on that. But really, the quest narrative here has become the journey narrative, which is similar, but I think distinct. We see, too, the way that the land itself has changed. It isn't now simply pleasant. It isn't simply now, a place to freely move from one event to the next. It is antagonistic. It is more adult. It is pushing back against our travelers in a way that Narnia simply didn't in the first book, right? Even for all of the snow and the winter wastes, there was never a moment where they had to physically push through brambles or physically, experience this discomfort. And the narrative voice, I think, kind of draws that distinction here rather beautifully. Actually, the gorge is great if what you want is a stroll and a picnic. If what you want is a peaceful, simple, straightforward fairy tale kind of adventure, then the gorge is perfect. But if what you are doing is hurrying to get to a place out of military necessity, right? If you really have a great sense of urgency upon you, then the gorge is difficult to traverse, just as difficult, or maybe just as difficult as the fir wood itself, right? So that distinction, I think, obviously is not a new one. We've been talking about it throughout this entire unit, but here it is becoming more and more clear. But we're also introducing the idea of, I guess, treachery, right? The landscape itself is conspiring against our heroes, but in such a way that it's also providing space, it's providing affordance for a guide, right? Should they have a guide, they would be able to traverse this landscape much more simply, much more directly, much more swiftly. luckily, they will have that guide in the pages to come. So this is kind of setting the stage for this part of their journey. We talked a little about this last week with the diminishment of our tone from the great memories of their quests aboard their glass-like, we can speculate, crystalline. I don't know what glass-like means in terms of their swan-shaped boat exactly, but it certainly suggests a kind of finery, a kind of luxury, a kind of elegance there. The stepping down from that condition into the condition of Peter rowing, kind of being a little grumpy with Lucy, of Lucy's inability to help, right? It's not simply command. Her ability to command as a queen of Narnia has no power in that moment. It is just the physical act of traversal. So we start there, and then we get to their exhaustion on the riverbank when they make it to Narnia properly, and now the hike too. Let's keep going on, because there is something, though, crucially, that is happening, and it happens first to Lucy. Of course, if the children had attempted a journey like this a few days ago in England, they would have been worn out. I think I have explained before how Narnia was altering them. Even Lucy was by now, so to speak, only 1/3 of a little girl going to a boarding school for the first time, and 2/3 of Queen Lucy of Narnia. "At last," said Susan. "Oh, hooray," said Peter. The river gorge had just made a bend, and the whole view spread out beneath them. They could see open country stretching before them to the horizon, and between it and them the broad silver ribbon, of the great river. They could see the specially broad and shallow place which had once been the fords of Bruna, but was now spanned by a long, many-arched bridge. There was a little town at the far end of it. "By Jove," said Edmund, "we fought the Battle of Bruna just where that town is." This cheered the boys more than anything. You can't help feeling stronger when you look at a place where you won a glorious victory, not to mention a kingdom, hundreds of years ago. So again, right, Narnia has been transformed. It has been, in a sense, tamed, and it's inviting, I think, to start to talk about the taming of Narnia by the Telmarines, right? We can be pretty sure that this bridge was not constructed during the Golden Age, otherwise the children of Pevensey would have, I'm just going to make their regular term of address now even more archaic. The Pevensey children would surely have remembered the construction of that bridge. More importantly, though, the Pevensey children would not have constructed that bridge. I talked last week a little bit about why DLF stands out to me as something so frictionally modern, because it's not indicative of the Pevensey children's desire to meet Narnia where Narnia is, to play by Narnia's rules, to meet it on its own terms, as it were. I can't really imagine the High King and the other king and queens of Narnia really constructing a bridge at Baruna. We'll maybe set that aside for now. This seems to me to be probably a Telmarine construction, because the Telmarines seem to be at odds, right? They are pursuing a social path that is orthogonal to the natural social path of Narnia. More on that later, when, spoilers, that bridge is going to go away in pretty short order. What's most important here, though, is, well, let's pause to observe the narrative voice again intruding, right? Again, kind of giving us some of this levity and some of this framing that we saw so much back in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and which has largely vanished. I mean, largely diminished, not vanished entirely, but is certainly much rarer in this book than it was in the previous book. And it's not just the assurance that everything is going to be okay. It's not just this extra perspective on what the children are feeling, but also the kind of self-conscious reinsertion of the voice of a book that you, the reader, are holding. I think I have explained before how Narnia was altering them. Well, no, narrative voice, you haven't explained before how this has happened. You have kind of noted that it is happening. You have led us to infer that it is happening, but you have not outright said this is occurring. And certainly we get a measure of that right here on this page, right? The boys remember the battle that they fought, and you can't help but be cheered up when you remember winning a battle and winning a kingdom too at Baruna. But Lucy is the one that's called out here. And I think it's interesting that Lucy is, by implication, more Narnian now than the others. She is re-entering this world more fully. She's the one who is feeling less friction from the world around her, right? She's suffering less. She's less uncomfortable. She's less downhearted and to some extent less mean-spirited, right? At some point or another, within 10 pages in either direction of this moment, all of the kids are going to snipe at each other, except for Lucy. She's the one who is still keeping that Narnian spirit. So we travel down the gorge and eventually have to turn around and go back, the way that Aslan was indicating to Lucy in the first place. I suppose we'll have to go right up the gorge again now, said Lucy. Lou, you're a hero, said Peter. That's the nearest you've got today to saying I told you so. Let's get on. As soon as we're well up into the forest, said Trumpkin, whatever anyone says, I'm going to light a fire and cook supper, but we must get well away from here. There is no need to describe how they toiled back up the gorge. It was pretty hard work, but oddly enough, everyone felt more cheerful. They were getting their second wind, and the word supper had a wonderful effect. So I want to call out here Peter's honest and sincere generosity, right? Not just does he doesn't just recognize that Lucy is not saying I told you so, but he commends her for going so far and for saying it so slightly. Well, said Lucy, I guess we're just going to have to turn around and go the way that I said we should go this whole time. And Peter commends her for that, which seems to be a very good-hearted and generous moment from him, and kind of a good-hearted moment from the narrative voice in order to acknowledge that in Peter. We're not going to get the same kind of good-hearted nature from this narrative voice in the pages to come, I promise you, because tonight's reading is going to be pretty harsh on Susan. We'll get to all of that. I think, in fact, in the next slide, perhaps it might be really, really soon. But I wanted to call out here, right? We've descended this gorge, as the narrative voice noted earlier. That was hard work. It was difficult moving down the gorge. Fine enough if it's just for a stroll and a picnic, but really difficult if you're moving with purpose, if you're moving with urgency. Then we get to the bottom, we are assaulted, and we have to turn around and retrace our steps into the firwood where we did not want to go in the first place. This is a disaster. This is a bad scene, you guys, but we're feeling more optimistic. We're feeling more hopeful. Are we feeling more hopeful because Trumpkin said he's going to stop and light a fire and cook the bear meat that we have with us, from that bear that we had to slaughter and skin right there in the forest? Perhaps the narrative voice is being completely sincere, and just supper has a wonderful effect. Supper is a magic word in Narnia. But I don't think it's a coincidence that we are now following in the footsteps of Aslan. We are now doing as we were by proxy instructed to do. We are behaving ourselves. We are, right, meeting Narnia on its own terms. There's no more friction here. It's not that the physical act of traversing the world has become easier. In fact, we might speculate that it's become much more difficult to climb the gorge rather than descend the gorge, but we are acting in accordance with our instructions, and so we are feeling more optimistic, right? And this is contrary to our modern perspective on authority and instruction, right? Maybe we as 21st century folk maybe chafe a little bit at the idea that, well, if you just behave yourself and go along with what you're told, then everything will be just fine. If you stop being naughty, right? The way that Susan calls Lucy out for being naughty. If you just stop being naughty and you behave yourself, then everything will be easier. And won't that be nice? We have to understand that Lewis is writing from a perspective that accounts for, that celebrates an actual authority, right? There's an actual hierarchy of obedience here. As we'll see in just a moment, in fact, as Lucy wakes. I want to pull this out for the second time. Yes, here we go. So this is the second night. You'll remember Lucy had her wakefulness, her dream ? Her vision ? Her mystical experience of some sort, right? She had a moment where she touched something more profound, or almost touched something more profound, and then it went away. And then the following night, this is her experience. Lucy woke out of the deepest sleep you can imagine with the feeling that the voices she liked best in the world had been calling her name. She thought at first it was her father's voice, but that didn't seem quite right. Then she thought it was Peter's voice, but that did not seem to fit either. She did not want to get up, not because she was still tired. On the contrary, she was wonderfully rested and all the aches had gone from her bones, but because she felt so extremely happy and comfortable. She was looking straight up at the Narnian moon, which is larger than ours, and at the starry sky, for the place where they had bivouacked was comparatively open. Lucy, came the call again, neither her father's voice nor Peter's. She stood up trembling with excitement, but not with fear. The moon was so bright that the whole forest landscape around her was almost as clear as day, though it looked wilder. Behind her was the firwood, away to her right the jagged cliff tops on the far side of the gorge, straight ahead, open grass, to where a glade of trees began about a bowshot away. Lucy looked very hard at the trees of that glade. What? I do believe they're moving, she said to herself. They're walking about. This is an incredibly important excerpt. This is an incredibly important passage in this book because it introduces a couple of concepts, as well as paying off, right, Lucy's vision of the trees the night before and really advancing her story. It introduces a couple of concepts which are going to be incredibly crucial, or I guess to one extent clarifies a concept, right? You'll remember in Lucy's previous adventure, The world is illuminated by the moonlight, but she cannot, crucially, see the moon. The moon itself is obscured. She looks up at the night sky and she can recognize the constellations. She sees the stars, just as she does here. But now, the second night, the moon is revealed too. And I will invite you all to speculate about the thematic significance of the moon. We're going to tie the moon and Aslan very closely together right at the end of tonight's reading. But it is a relationship that is never really clarified. It is a relationship which is clear, but which we're not given enough context to really understand. And if, per Michael Ward and the Planet Narnia book, we're inclined to look at this, and not even per Michael Ward, right? We don't have to look outside of the book to understand that there are astronomical factors which are significant here, right? We've had our Mars and Venus in conjunction in the sky, but the moon itself hasn't been mentioned. So I want to kind of lean into the obvious interpretations of the moon as a divinely feminine influence, right? As opposed to Aslan as a divinely masculine presence. It's a little loaded. Maybe don't want to put too much emphasis on that, but that is perhaps the first thing that leaps to mind. But the presence of the moon here is very significant. The other thing that is very important here, that is absolutely crucial here to our understanding of what is happening in Prince Caspian, particularly to the Pevensey children, is that she sits up trembling with excitement, but not fear. That absence of fear is phenomenally powerful. It is phenomenally important for us to understand why Lucy is a step ahead or a step away from her siblings at this point. We'll look more clearly at that in just a moment. Of course, we'll recognize too, since we're talking about, divine masculine authority, she hears a voice. She thinks first it's her father. No, not her father. Maybe it's Peter. No, not Peter, right? Peter as her eldest brother and also as High King of Narnia, kind of fulfilling that masculine archetype, right? She hears this voice. She identifies something resonant within it and runs through her possible candidates. Well, maybe it's the most important man in my life. No, maybe it's the second most important man in my life. No, it's some kind of important man in my life, right? We'll move on and circle back to our thoughts on Aslan in the pages to come. And I want to acknowledge too, I'm kind of halfway through a conversation via email with a listener who wanted to remain anonymous, or rather did not want me to use their name on the show. But I wanted to acknowledge the perspective that perhaps we might interpret Lucy's first dream as a slipping away of innocence, a slipping away of childhood, and kind of pair that with the idea that ultimately what Lucy comes to is a greater understanding of wonder. I think for now we're just going to put a pin in that, and I guess I want to kind of unpick this as best I can, and I'm doing so without real preparation here. That I suppose I put forth the idea that there may be a loss of innocence or a loss of the capacity for wonder associated with what Lucy experiences in the glade, right? You'll remember that she's calling out to the trees. She asks them to talk. She does not intend to talk. And then she finds herself talking to the trees and then has this feeling that it just hasn't gone right, that something magical is missing, that something is absent. And there's also, simultaneously, the literary argument that this is just a narrative foreshadowing of the return of Aslan, right? This is the kind of thing that characters do back in the first book, right? Mr. and Mrs. Beaver say, Aslan is on the move. Father Christmas, Aslan is on the move, right? Aslan is present in Narnia before we ever meet him. And maybe this is just that same kind of foreshadowing of Aslan's presence. And the reason that Lucy's appeal to the trees doesn't work is simply that it's not time yet. Rather than there being something lost, it hasn't arrived yet. And I do think that there's a legitimacy to that reading. Absolutely. I think that that's a valid piece of interpretation. I would hold this first moment between Lucy and the trees elevated for a little longer until we get into what the moral schematic is that's being presented to us ultimately by Aslan, of course. But it's framed out here too, right? With excitement, but not with fear, is absolutely crucial in this reading. Let's push on here to, I guess, yeah, right? Because the unspoken part of that is, yes, I think that foreshadowing the return of Aslan is part of the why of that earlier scene, but perhaps doesn't give us sufficient illumination as to the how of that scene. If we take Lucy's moment in the glade with the trees, the first moment in the glade with the trees, and then we take the second moment in the glade with the trees actually beginning to move, actually like becoming the humanoid versions of themselves that Lucy foresaw in the previous version. How is that giving us an understanding of Aslan's return, right? What is it doing in the world as distinct from Aslan's return in the first book, which is so oriented around the breaking of the White Witch's magic, right? Let's move on and we'll see what we can get to with, of course, Aslan. "Welcome, child," he said. "Aslan," said Lucy, "you're bigger." "That is because you are older, little one," answered he. "Not because you are?" "I am not. But every year you grow, you will find me bigger." For a time, she was so happy that she didn't want to speak. But Aslan spoke. "Lucy," he said, "we must not lie here for long. You have work in hand, and much time has been lost today." "Yes, wasn't it a shame?" said Lucy. "I saw you all right. They wouldn't believe me. They're also—" From somewhere deep inside Aslan's body there came the faintest suggestion of a growl. "I'm sorry," said Lucy, who understood some of his moods. "I don't mean to start slanging the others, but it wasn't my fault anyway, was it?" This is one of those sections which is endlessly debated by people seeking a Christian perspective on the works of C.S. Lewis, right? Aslan is bigger, and he is bigger because Lucy is older. He himself does not grow older, but every time that she will see him, he will be bigger. It's rich. I mean, we can talk, of course, about the obvious metaphor here for like the growth of faith, for the capacity of faith, right? That a child's faith is a simple thing. A child's faith can only be a simple thing because faith should be informed by experience, by diversity of experience. It should be enriched by both the joys and the grief of life, right? That faith grows and develops over time, or should grow and develop over time, and thus to every subsequent person, Aslan will appear larger. I mean, I don't know how you can completely pin that down, given that, Lucy and Peter are different ages and have had different measures of grief and joy, different experiences, both in Narnia and out of it, right? Edmund in particular. Does Aslan appear significantly larger to Edmund for his experiences with the White Witch? Well, and his experiences, back in England, right? We learn in the pages of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that it's when he goes away to boarding school that he begins to change, right? He is, we can infer, bullied at boarding school, and that starts him down this dark path that isn't finally restored until he arrives in Narnia, ultimately restored until he finally arrives in Narnia. So is there room for interpretation there? Well, no. I mean, we don't get anything on the page that suggests that that's true, but it is an evocative metaphor nonetheless. It is kind of undeniable nonetheless. We see here too Aslan kind of exerting an authority and exerting a kind of call for civility, right? If we are to interpret the narrative voice's interpretation of what is actually happening in this scene accurately, then we can see Lucy's frustration. "Wasn't it a shame? I saw you all right. They wouldn't believe me. They're also pig-headed. They're also stubborn. They're also willing to ignore me. And they think they're so superior," right? She snaps at Susan, you'll remember. "Don't talk like a grown-up," she says to Susan. "Don't ask me where did I think I saw him. I saw him," right? Even Lucy can be frustrated in these moments. But Aslan kind of gives this almost a hint of a growl. And Lucy, we're told, understands his mood, and so mollifies herself, right? "I didn't mean to start slanging the others, but it wasn't my fault anyway, was it?" Right? And the ambiguity there, it wasn't my fault anyway, was it? It wasn't my fault. Was it my fault? Am I seeking reassurance here, or am I seeking confirmation? It wasn't my fault that they're stupid and stubborn, was it? It wasn't my fault that they didn't believe me? Well, maybe. Or maybe she's asking, right? Was it my fault that they didn't believe me? Should I have done more? Should I have spoken more passionately, more rationally, more reasonably? It's a debate open to the ages, to be sure. Let's move on to just a little more from Lucy and Aslan here. This is when Aslan instructs her to go back and tell the others to follow him. "But they won't believe me," said Lucy. "It doesn't matter," said Aslan. Oh dear, said Lucy. "And I was so pleased at finding you again, and I thought you'd let me stay. I thought you'd come roaring in and frighten all the enemies away, like last time. And now everything is going to be horrid." "It is hard for you, little one," said Aslan. "But things never happen the same way twice. It has been hard for us all in Narnia before now." Lucy buried her head in his mane to hide from his face. But there must have been magic in his mane. She could feel lion strength going into her. Quite suddenly, she sat up. "I'm sorry, Aslan," she said. "I'm ready now." "Now you are a lioness," said Aslan. "And now all Narnia will be renewed. But come, we have no time to lose." I think that lioness might be the most confounding word in this entire book. There has been a lot of ink spilled trying to unpick exactly what it is that Lewis is getting at here. And there's a standard interpretation, right? Because I'll frame this out in case you're unfamiliar with academic criticism of C.S. Lewis's work. Most analysis of the Narniad has been done from a Christian perspective, and most of it is kind of, in terms of its interpretation at least, kind of backwards. It's kind of deciding on the allegory first and then mapping that allegory to the events of the book. And there is therefore a standard interpretation. Not all of that scholarship, I should say, is bad. I think that it is coming at the book, coming at the text from fundamentally the wrong direction, but it's a different type of purpose, right? I'm more interested in the Narniad as a story rather than a series of Christian apologetics. But if you're coming at it as a series of Christian apologetics, then it's only right to start with what you understand to be the underlying allegory and to map the story to it. It's just a different interpretive purpose. I am coming to this book as fiction rather than as a manual on how to behave, right? As an instructive piece of text aimed at the juvenile reader. But even if you're coming at it from that other perspective, there's a set of standard interpretations, I suppose, which involve some variation of faith and evangelism, right? Lucy has faith and will proclaim that faith going forward, even if no one believes her. Thus, she is like Aslan and therefore a lioness. And I read that interpretation, I don't know, a dozen times in the last couple of weeks. And I've got to tell you, it doesn't really stick with me. It doesn't really work for me because even from a pretty casual reading, I think that we can see some gaps in that interpretation. Let's gather our facts and then we can talk about interpretation, right? First, Aslan appears as a lion in Narnia. And I don't mean to unnecessarily hedge there. We might well say that Aslan is a lion, thus Aslanic qualities and leonine qualities are one and the same, right? Thus, to say that Lucy is like a lioness is to say that Lucy is like Aslan, but Aslan crucially isn't the only lion, right? He's, I guess, the unnamed lion in the first book does claim a kinship with Aslan. He puts himself and Aslan in the same kind of order. The quote from the first book is this: "Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness," right? That's from chapter 16 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So that lion, at least, is willing to, or eager to, put himself in the same category as Aslan. Thus, Aslan is not a special kind of lion. He is just a lion, right? He's also obviously a lion in a more immediate and physical way. But that's not all, though, because to look again back at the first book, when the Beavers introduce the concept of Aslan, they describe him thus. This is the quote: "Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion." And we know how important capital letters are to C.S. Lewis when he distinguishes between different categories of being. So we should therefore note that Aslan is a lion, lowercase l, the lion, uppercase L, the great lion, uppercase L. Aslan is in fact referred to as the lion, capital L, throughout the entire first book in the series. Edmund then sees the stone lion at the White Witch's house, the stone lion that will become the lion that puts himself in the same category as Aslan later in the book, right? Oh, I meant to mention this too. Upon which, right, the stone lion that Edmund meets, he draws upon his face a beaglepuss. A beaglepuss is the name for the Groucho Marx glasses with eyebrows and nose and moustache thing. That is a beaglepuss. And I think, therefore, that we shall refer to that lion, the lion in the first book who is not Aslan, as Beaglepuss. That's going to be a useful name for him going forward. It also kind of reminds me of the 1970s British television show Bagpuss, which is extremely bad, as all 1970s TV shows are, but was nonetheless a great fixture of my very, very early childhood. I watched more Bagpuss and the Clangers and the Wombles, all of which kind of share the same kind of visual aesthetic. Maybe I'll drop some links in the show notes. You guys can go and check that out. So the lion, right? It is possible that the lion, that Beaglepuss the lion, also shares some of those evangelical qualities, right? Some of those qualities of both faith and evangelism of faith, that he also believes in Aslan and is going forth proclaiming that belief, even if he is not believed, even if he is not followed, even if his words have no impact, make no difference at all, right? Thus, he is lion-like in the way that Lucy is lion-like. It's possible, right? We're getting into really fine distinctions of semantics here. And in the sake of being thorough, I will note that when Beaglepus talks about us lions, right, he also uses the uppercase L, but maybe that's aspirational. Maybe he is elevating himself to the condition of Aslan rather than recognizing a shared and common state there. And I say this all, crucially, not to nitpick, right? Not to just find holes in particularly Christian argumentation about this book, but to rather observe that Lewis was an incredibly skilled and thoughtful theologian. He was an author of a great number of Christian apologetics. If he had set out to make a simple and transparent and dogmatically approved metaphor for Christian faith as he understood it, then he could have done so very easily. He did so many times. This is something different. This, because it doesn't track, we can, and I know, I'm on shaky, moral philosophy ground here. Evidence of absence is not absence of evidence, is not evidence of absence in this particular case. But there is something operating. I want to put the slide back up, in fact, because I'm going to refer to it right here. This idea that Lucy is a good Christian because she continues to believe in Jesus allegory, because she and she alone has been presented with evidence of Jesus's presence, right? This does not seem to me to be very, very firm ground here, theologically speaking. If you are presented with incontrovertible evidence of the existence of Jesus, then believing in Jesus isn't an act of faith. It is a logical response. It is a logical response to your lived experience. There is something in faith that stands apart from personal experience. And I know I'm getting into like questions of mysticism and mysticality in the church too, but this seems to me to be a little bit different, right? And one of the arguments that Lewis would probably push back against here, right? Lucy has been shown Aslan. Therefore, to believe in Aslan is actually not that impressive. It's kind of more impressive if Peter, who has not seen Aslan, believes in Aslan. It's also weird to interpose someone. This is perhaps too big a subject given the time already and how much more material we have to cover. There's also something weird happening with the interposition of Lucy as a herald figure here. Is she something of a silver surfer for Aslan here? Is she something of a priestess for Aslan here, right? What are the categories of people who are empowered by direct contact with their deity to go off and proclaim the good news of their faith? It's complex, but we don't have to rely, thankfully, on fighting our way through this thicket of speculation. We can just look at the text. As you'll see here on your screen, Aslan tasks Lucy specifically with returning to the others, with waking them and with telling them that they must follow him even if they don't see him, even if they don't believe her, right? That's our framework where they come in. They won't believe me, said Lucy. It doesn't matter, said Aslan. It doesn't matter that they won't believe you. This is a thing that you have to do nonetheless. My goal here is not necessarily for them to believe you. My goal is to have you say the words. You have to do the thing. Lucy then, has this kind of heartbreaking moment of perspective and complaint. She really wanted him to just sweep in and roar and scare everyone away, scare the bad guys away, and everything would be fine. You'll note here too, right? Scare their enemies away again, suggesting that maybe Lucy doesn't have the clearest memory of the battle against the White Witch, right? Because that's not really what happened. She says now that everything is going to be hard. Aslan implicitly agrees, and it's going to be hard for you. It's been hard for everyone in Narnia. What exactly is going to be hard? Is Lucy talking about the war, or is she talking about not being believed again by her siblings, right? This is kind of a bruise for Lucy by this point, right? Going all the way back to the beginning of the first book. She tells them about Narnia, and they don't believe her, partly because Edmund decides to tease her. Then he goes into Narnia, comes back, and says, nope, absolutely not. There's nothing there. Lucy's just imagining it all. And now, once again, she's telling the truth of her experience and is not being believed. But look at what happens here. Lucy, upset at all of this, right? Whether we accept that she is worried about the upcoming war or she's worried about once again being disbelieved by her siblings, whatever the case, she is upset and she is acknowledging the hardship here. And then she buries her face in Aslan's mane, and we get this note about the lion's strength flowing into her. She then immediately feels ready, and Aslan observes that she is a lioness. So isn't it much more likely, given this close reading, that Lucy's lionessness is directly and personally derived from Aslan in that moment, that there is some magical giving of strength here rather than a recognition of some more abstracted personal virtue of Lucy? Is it possible that what we're seeing here is exactly the kind of strength that is bestowed by Aslan onto others, right? We're going to see this repeatedly through the end of the book. He's going to breathe, and all at once people are going to feel better, right? I'm thinking of Susan. I'm thinking of the nurse. I'm thinking of Reepicheep. I'm thinking, there are multiple instances of Aslan's presence, yes, but also direct breath, giving a quality of strength, yes, and I'm navigating around saying exactly what I think that this quality is. We will get to all of that. We will get to all of that. And this is not for me to, as I say, to nitpick this common interpretation, this common Christian interpretation, particularly, of what Lewis is doing here, but rather to point out that we don't necessarily have to map to the allegory when we can just read the text, when we can just look clearly here and see what is consonant with a transfer of strength from Aslan to the people close to Aslan throughout the book. Wow, we are already running so very late. Let's get into our next slide. We've got one more slide, and that's going to finish us up with chapter 10. And then, thankfully, we'll be able to start on this week's reading of the book. This is Lucy going back to the camp, of course. She went to Peter first and shook him. "Peter," she whispered in his ear, "wake up, quick, Aslan is here. He says we've got to follow him at once." "Certainly, Lou, whatever you like," said Peter unexpectedly. This was encouraging. But as Peter instantly rolled around and went back to sleep again, it wasn't much use. Then she tried Susan. Susan did really wake up, but only to say in her most annoying, grown-up voice, "You've been dreaming, Lucy. Go to sleep again." She tackled Edmund next. It was very difficult to wake him, but when at last she had done it, he was really awake and sat up. "Huh?" he said in a grumpy voice. "What are you talking about?" She said it all over again. This was one of the worst parts of her job, for each time she said it, it sounded less convincing. "Aslan," said Edmund, jumping up. "Hooray! Where?" Lucy turned back to where she could see the lion waiting, his patient eyes fixed upon her. "There," she said, pointing. "Where?" said Edmund again. And so we see the conundrum. We see the dilemma with which Lucy is faced. She can see Aslan clearly right here with her, but the others can't. And so she has to keep repeating the story, which feels as though it is less true every time she says it, right? Every time she said it, it sounded less convincing. Aslan is right there. She can absolutely see him in that moment, and yet still the story feels as though it's slipping away from her. There needs to be some kind of acceptance or I don't know, a kind of narrative reciprocity, right? The relationship between audience and storyteller, the relationship between reader and author here. The story cannot just exist in the mind or in the mouth of the storyteller. It has to be received in order for it to be true. If you keep telling the same story and you aren't believed, then it will start to feel thin and insubstantial, regardless of its objective truth. Okay, let's move into chapter 11 here and pick up with the others. Another example of Lewis just breaking chapters after like a certain amount of pages. It feels like it's very rhythmic. I noted back when we were laying out the structure for this unit how conveniently it broke down into 3 5-chapter readings. Now, of course, I blew that last week through my own callow self-indulgence, but still, it does break very neatly into 3 5-chapter readings because the chapters are so even and so structurally reinforced, I suppose, rather than like narratively reinforced. The chapters end when the chapters need to end because there hasn't been a chapter break in a while. And then we move forward, in this case, into chapter 11. And a slide that I have noted is ought to be entitled, "When you gotta go, you gotta go." "He's beating his paw on the ground for us to hurry," said Lucy. "We must go now. At least I must." "You've no right to try to force the rest of us like that. It's 4-1 and you're the youngest," said Susan. "Oh, come on," growled Edmund. "We've got to go. There'll be no peace till we do." He fully intended to back Lucy up, but he was annoyed at losing his night's sleep and was making up for it by doing everything as sulkily as possible. "On the march, then," said Peter, wearily fitting his arm into the shield strap and putting his helmet on. At any other time he would have said something nice to Lucy, who was his favourite sister, for he knew how wretched she must be feeling, and he knew that whatever had happened, it was not her fault, but he couldn't help but being a little annoyed with her all the same. Susan was the worst. "Supposing I started behaving like Lucy," she said, "I might threaten to stay here whether the rest of you went on or not. I jolly well think that I shall." "Obey the High King, your Majesty," said Trumpkin, and let's be off. if I'm not to be allowed to sleep, I'd as soon march as stand here talking. I completely lost my own copy of the slide here in front of the screen as I was reading. That's technical problems will continue to befall us here. That's fine. I think that the video is going to remain okay. And of course, if you're listening to the podcast version, you just heard me being unable to read a paragraph and no more besides. So in any case, Trumpkin urges her to obey the High King and let's be off. I mean, it's kind of hard to be a constant defender of Susan by the time we get to this part of Prince Caspian, and I do understand the opposition. It is to a purpose, right? We are doing something with Susan here. Lewis has an arc for her that we're going to resolve in fact, the next slide. It's not going to last very long. But it's pretty hard here, you know. You've no right to try to force the rest of us like that. It's 4-1, and you're the youngest. It's 4-1 is something, right? If you're going to include Trumpkin and give him a vote too, that's something. That at least, it's a democracy, and you have been voted against is fine. But to imply also you're the youngest, and thus your vote is the least substantial, your vote is the least significant. Well, that's something else entirely, isn't it? And then, of course, to have Peter confirm, or to have the narrative voice confirm on Peter's behalf, Lucy, who was his favorite sister. You know, out of the two sisters that you have, you should definitely rank them in an objective hierarchy here. And then the flat. What was, I will say, for the longest time, the actual title of this week's episode of Stars and Swords, Susan was the worst. I was just going to use that. And I felt bad about it every time, because once again, I am an advocate for Susan Pevensey. I think that Susan gets a tough rap from many, many, many of the readers of this series. And it is hard to defend her when this is what we're doing. So they follow after Aslan, and Edmund begins to see first his shadow, right? Edmund following most closely behind Lucy, being the most sensitive to Lucy, being the most open to what she is saying, right? Wanting the most to believe her, first starts seeing Aslan's shadow, and then Aslan himself. Peter follows thereafter. But the narrative voice notes that still, even at that point, Susan and Trumpkin cannot see Aslan, at least until we reach our destination. And Susan, very sweetly, I think, apologizes. "Lucy," said Susan in a very small voice. "Yes," said Lucy. "I see him now. I'm sorry." "That's all right. But I've been far worse than you know. I really believed it was him. Yesterday, when he warned us not to go down to the fir wood. And I really believed it was him tonight when you woke us up. I mean, deep down inside, or I could have if I'd let myself, but I just wanted to get out of the woods and I don't know. Whatever am I to say to him?" "Perhaps you won't need to say much," suggested Lucy. Soon they had reached the trees, and through them the children could see the great mound, Aslan's How, which had been raised over the table since their days. So Susan really believes that it is Aslan the whole time, right? If we're to believe this account, and I have no reason to doubt this account, because if anything, it makes Susan seem worse than she would otherwise. If she just didn't believe Lucy, if it seemed impossible, if it seemed if she were herself genuinely incredulous, then that would be a different kind of perspective on Susan's character, right? A damning perspective, to be sure, a grown-up perspective, to be sure, but not as damning, not as tragic, not as, just as genuinely sad as this account here, right? She wanted to believe in Aslan. She, in a sense, did believe, but she couldn't let herself believe because she wanted to be out of the forest. She wanted to be free of this physical opposition. Well, maybe, to some extent, right? She wanted an easier path, perhaps. Didn't want to fight through the forest in pursuit of Aslan, but I think that there's something else going on here, and we get to that when she finally talks with Aslan. Let's keep moving on. We have so much to do here, right? But this is the end, at least, of Susan's little mini arc that we're going to get. And also, crucially, the introduction to the most powerful thematic opposition that we're going to get in the back half of this book. This is going to be a topic that we will return to very often as we move through the rest of tonight's reading. "Oh, Aslan," said King Peter, dropping on one knee and raising the lion's heavy paw to his face. "I'm so glad, and I'm so sorry. I've been leading them wrong ever since we started, and especially yesterday morning." "My dear son," said Aslan. Then he turned and welcomed Edmund. "Well done," were his words. Then, after an awful pause, the deep voice said, "Susan." Susan made no answer, but the others thought she was crying. "You have listened to fears, child," said Aslan. "Come, let me breathe on you. Forget them. Are you brave again?" "A little, Aslan," said Susan. "And now," said Aslan in a much louder voice with just a hint of a roar in it, while his tail lashed his flanks, "and now, where is this little dwarf, this famous swordsman and archer who doesn't believe in lions? Come here, son of earth, come here." And the last word was no longer the hint of a roar, but almost the real thing. Aslan, every bit as theatrical as he was back in the pages of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So this is crucial, right? And we get an opposition here which is extremely important, and we're going to circle back in a moment to a point of comparison from earlier in the reading. Aslan puts here, I think, his metaphorical paw on the issue exactly. Why doesn't Susan choose to believe in Aslan? Is it a desire for physical comfort? Is it just strictly reinforcing the hierarchy of their family where Peter's at the top and Lucy's resolutely at the bottom? No, it's fear. That's what swamps her desire to believe in Aslan. That is what prevents her from accepting what it is that Lucy is saying. It's fear of the forest. It's fear of difficulty. It's fear of the battle that is to come. It's fear of their place in Narnia now. Maybe to some extent, it's even a fear, that kind of hopeful fear that you get of wanting to believe in something and running the risk of disappointment, right? She acknowledges here to Aslan. Aslan confirms, "You have listened to fears, child. Come let me breathe on you." Again, right? Echoing that personal interaction that we just saw with Lucy. "Come let me breathe on you. Forget them. Are you brave again?" "A little, Aslan," says Susan, right? It's already working. She's already being restored by the presence of Aslan. She's already overcoming her fear. I'm not, at this point, going to sink into the litany of fear. We have no time for mind killers or for the little death that leads to total oblivion. We will, however, as I say, circle back to fear as a major theme in tonight's reading. First, though, we are going to awake all of Narnia. Here we are. The dwarf was still speechless, and neither of the boys dared to ask if Aslan would follow them. All three drew their swords and saluted, then turned and jingled away into the dusk. Lucy noted that there was no sign of weariness on their faces. Both the High King and King Edmund looked more like men than boys. The girls watched them out of sight, standing close beside Aslan. The light was changing. Low down in the east, out of here, the morning star of Narnia gleamed like a little moon. Aslan, who had seemed larger than before, lifted his head, shook his mane, and roared. The sound, deep and throbbing at first like an organ beginning on a low note, rose and became louder, and then far louder again, till the earth and air were shaking with it. It rose up from that hill and floated across all Narnia. Down in Miraz's camp, men woke, stared palely in one another's faces, and grasped their weapons. Down below that, in the great river, now at its coldest hour, the heads and shoulders of the nymphs and the great weedy bearded head of the river god rose from the water. Beyond it, in every field and wood, the alert ears of rabbits rose from their holes, the sleepy heads of birds came out from under wings, owls hooted, vixens barked, hedgehogs grunted, and trees stirred. In towns and villages, mothers pressed babies close to their breasts, staring with wild eyes. Dogs whimpered, and men leapt up, groping for lights. Far away on the northern frontier, the mountain giants peered from the dark gateways of their castle. And I pull this passage partly because it has some important inflection points for what is going to come next, and mostly, I will admit, just because it rules. And this is really heavily, I think, Lewis in his fantastical mode, in his fantasy mode, as opposed to the fairy tale mode, right? We're acknowledging the simultaneous existence and reality of this entire landscape. We are presenting a world which more fully, I think, than it has at any point previous, feels like a complete place which exists. It feels more like Narnia itself, feels more like a piece of secondary creation than a stage upon which a fairy tale might occur. We'll note, of course, that Peter and Edmund now looking much more like men than like boys, right? The magic of Narnia is more inside them than it was even a moment ago, where the closer we get to Aslan, the closer we get to the source of this power, the more we are our Narnian selves. There's no indication here, I think. Well, I suppose Lucy does observe, right, that they look more like men than boys, but it's more in their faces. She noticed there was no sign of weariness in their face. I don't know. That's maybe ambiguous. Are they taller? Are they larger? Are they more like their adult selves? There's no explicit mention of that, and I don't think that that's what Lewis is getting at. It seems to me that this is more about demeanor, right? It's more about the spirit that is within you. You are more connected to your landscape at this time and in this place. We then get Aslan, of course, also seeming larger than before, right? As the faith rises, as the faith increases, so Aslan himself becomes larger, and the roar is more titanic and more powerful and more meaningful to everyone who hears it, right? You'll understand in exactly the same way as the children had their innate response to Aslan's name in the first book. So the hearing of his roar, for the first time, we can speculate, right? By any living creature in Narnia, probably the first time that they have ever heard it. But they still know what it is, right? Miraz's men look at each other, they go pale, they grab their weapons, they understand what is coming. Like, everyone can feel Aslan's presence in exactly the same way as the children did at the mention of his name back in the first book. We then get the party, and we have to segue a little bit here into some the classical world, right? We're going to get a more developed sense of the taxonomy that we introduced last week, with the trees taking human form again, certainly, right? The dryads and the hamadryads here. And then we get a man on a donkey and a youth with vine leaves entwined in his hair, Bromios, Bessarius, and the ram, as he is called, accompanied by a lot of girls as wild as he. Lucy, of course, figures it out after the fact. I'm going to call this up here, yes. At that moment, the sun was just rising, and Lucy remembered something and whispered to Susan, "I say, Sue, I know who they are." "Who?" "The boy with the wild face is Bacchus, and the old one on the donkey is Silenus. Don't you remember Mr. Tumnus telling us about them long ago?" "Yes, of course, but I say, Lou." "What?" "I wouldn't have felt safe with Bacchus and all his wild girls if we'd met them without Aslan." "I should think not," said Lucy. And if you are just listening to the podcast, or if you are watching this on a small screen that doesn't provide, sufficient picture-in-picture capability for you to really read my expression at this point, be assured that I am just dead-eyeing the camera with one of those classic John Krasinski looks. I mean, of course you wouldn't have felt safe unless Aslan had been here. When presented with all these wild girls and wine and revelry, Aslan is what? The boundary. He is the mediating force. He is the thing that makes it safe, which is so interesting because you'll remember back in the first book, Aslan very clearly not being safe. He's not safe. He's not a tame lion, but he is good. And I think that there's maybe some interpretive work that we can do here to figure out what exactly is good in this context, what is natural and what is good. Perhaps we can draw a distinction between those two things. But certainly and powerfully, we are seeing here Aslan, and by extension, the category of talking animal of Narnia, existing between the human beings on the one side and these creatures of classical antiquity on the other. This is, of course, Bacchus. This is, as Lucy points out here, Bacchus. This is Dionysus. I've pulled up the, yes, this is actually the quote from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is from chapter 2, right? Lucy isn't just making stuff up. She's actually pulling a memory from her time. Susan is not present for this encounter, but we can assume that Mr. Tumnus, after the fact, repeated these stories several times over. So this is from Lucy's first meeting. "He had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He told about the midnight dances and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fauns, about long hunting parties after the milk-white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him, about feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarfs in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor, and then about summer when the woods were green and old Silenus on his fat donkey would come to visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself, and then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollification for weeks on end." And it's wild to look back at the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and realize how much of this is now the foundation for Prince Caspian, right? How much of this has been brought out of not just the realm of fairy tale, but the realm of fairy tale at one remove. None of these things happen in the pages of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. They are all withheld. They are all pulled in only for this richer, deeper version of the Narnian story. So, as I say, this is Bacchus, this is Dionysus, this is Silenus. His women folk, the girls, the wild girls that Lucy and Susan do not entirely approve of, are the Maenads, of course. They're part of Dionysus's retinue in the Greek tradition. A group of intoxicated and ecstatic partygoers, right? Club girls, basically, is what I'm saying. Basically, they are club girls. They are collectively referred to, the entire retinue of Dionysus is collectively referred to as the Thyasus, and the Maenads begin as being representative of like nymphs and other nature spirits, but then become, as Greek culture advances, and advances is a dangerous word there, but as history accrues and as the mythological framework around Dionysus in Greek culture kind of warps and alters, they become human women who are ecstatic, yes, through wine and through dance. It's enormously sensual. It's enormously sexual. It is physical in a way that is entirely inappropriate for our young heroines to behold right now, which is why, of course, we're getting the PG-13 of Dionysus, thanks to the interposition of Aslan, right? And absolutely calling that out here, that they would not have felt safe if not for the presence of Aslan. That perhaps we ought not even to step out of the frame of Narnia a little and to look at Lewis's vertiginous perspective on human history, right? As a medievalist, as a classicist, to look back at classical antiquity, which, again, to the medieval mind, is one of grandeur that has fallen in the contemporary world. To look back on that and to think that, well, maybe it was great, maybe it ought to exist, maybe it should exist, but maybe it also ought to be, what? Made safe, right? Made tame, bowdlerized to some extent. I don't know. I'm not sure what the argument is here. The hierarchy, I think, is pretty clear. And obviously, we perhaps ought not to delve too deep into the excesses of the classical world in a book that is supposed to remain resolutely for children. But this is just such a great reading. I think I'm so charmed by all of this and by the return of Bacchus here. Bromios, which is mentioned as one of his names, means literally the boisterous one. Bessarius is taken from the gold robes worn by the in real life followers of Bacchus, right? Of Dionysus and the Roman there. And then this chant that we get, this Ewan, you, oi, oi, oi. Ewan is another one of his names. This is all folded into the repeated chant. And what is most importantly, of course, sounds like a party. So we get this encapsulation exactly of the kind of taxonomy that we sketched last week. We get, I think, a pretty clear confirmation of that. And as I say, a setting into hierarchical order. And it might not even be the hierarchical order that we would have expected, unless we were really paying close attention to the role and duties and responsibilities of human beings in the land of Narnia. Let's move on then into chapter 12, halfway through our reading, but so much more than halfway through our time. Let's see if we can wrap this up in a pretty judicious manner. Trumpkin leads the boys. You'll note here too, right, a real powerful shift in our focus and in our tone after just taking Lewis to task for breaking his chapters wherever they happen to fall. This is a real chapter break. We really have a shift in tone and a shift in purpose here. And we're going to preserve that largely between the girls and the boys, right? Between Peter and Edmund on the one hand and Susan and Lucy on the other, pretty much throughout the rest of the book. Unlike the first book, that's going to feel like less a discarding of Susan and Lucy, right? But it is still a pretty strict gender distinction as far as the kinds of action that we're allowed to take and the direct consequences of that action. We're going to very much see Edmund and Peter in a martial mode, and we're going to see something much more gentle, much more collaborative over on the other side of the gender aisle there. But we'll get to all of that as we move forward. For now, though, we're going to be deep into that martial mode as we slip into Aslan's how and overhear a conversation. "You know well enough," said a voice. "That's the king," whispered Trumpkin. "Why, the horn was not blown at sunrise this morning. Have you forgotten that Miraz fell upon us almost before Trumpkin had gone, and we were fighting for our lives for the space of 3 hours and more? I blew it when I first had breathing space." "I'm not likely to forget it," came the angry voice. "When my dwarves bore the brunt of the attack, and 1 in 5 of them fell." "That's Nikabrik," whispered Trumpkin. "For shame, dwarf," came a thick voice. "Truffle hunters," said Trumpkin. "We all did as much of the dwarves, and none more than the king." "Tell your tale your own way for all I care," answered Nikabrik. "But whether it was the horn that was blown too late, or whether there was no magic in it, no help has come. You great clerk, you master magician, you know all. Are you still asking for us to hang our hopes on Aslan and King Peter and all the rest of it?" "I must confess, I cannot deny it. I am deeply disappointed in the results of the operation," came the answer. "That's Dr. Cornelius," said Trumpkin. So we're immediately into the thick of it here. We're into the thick of, well, politics, right? I called this out, I think, back in the first session of this unit, that one of the things which distinguishes this transformation from fairy tale to fantasy is the introduction of politics. It's the introduction of disagreement. It's the introduction of this kind of disagreement verging on outright dispute, right? We talked last time about how Trumpkin sees counsel, that you can disagree with the king, but you cannot oppose the king. You can give him your perspective. You are, in fact, duty-bound as a member of his inner circle, as a member of his council. Your purpose is to give the king your perspective, to offer your wisdom in any way that you might, but then to do as you were told. And now we're seeing that Nikabrik is, well, pushing back against that quite harshly. Nikabrik, we learn, has brought friends with him into this council. An old woman capable of casting spells. I mean, we might well infer the aforementioned hag has now shown up. And, fascinatingly, a werewolf who is treated unlike a werewolf in basically any way except that he is monstrous. It's a kind of non-specific monster form that I find really interesting, that Lewis should have used that over, any one of a dozen other monsters that you could have used in the book at this point. And the only other mention of werewolves that we've had to date so far is right at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when the slaying of the werewolf, right, is basically listed as one of the accomplishments of the Pevensey children in the 15 years of the Narnian Golden Age. But apparently not all of the werewolves were dealt with, because one of them is right here. This is, I'm sorry, I will put my slide back there. There we go. "Is this open treason, dwarf?" asked the king. "Put that sword back in its sheath, Caspian," said Nikabrik. "Murder at council, eh? Is that your game? Don't be fool enough to try it. Do you think I'm afraid of you? There's 3 on my side and 3 on yours." "Come on then," snarled Trufflehunter, and he was immediately interrupted. "Stop, stop, stop," said Dr. Cornelius. "You go on too fast. The witch is dead. All the stories agree on that. What does Nikabrik mean by calling on the witch?" That grey and terrible voice, which had spoken once only, had spoken only once before, said, "Oh, is she?" And then the shrill, whining voice began, "Oh, bless his heart. His dear little majesty doesn't mind about the White Lady. That's what we call her being dead. The worshipful Master Doctor is only making game of a poor old woman like me when he says that. Sweet Master Doctor, learned Master Doctor, who ever heard of a witch that really died? You can always get them back." "Call her up," said the grey voice. "We are all ready. Draw the circle. Prepare the blue fire." Above the steadily increasing growl of the badger and Cornelius's sharp "What?" rose the voice of King Caspian like thunder. "So that is your plan, Nikabrik. Black sorcery and the calling up of an accursed ghost. And I see who your companions are. A hag and a werewolf." The decision to have our heroes stand outside in the hall listening to this entire exchange is fascinating, is genuinely fascinating. And it's really great, I think, to oh boy, there are like 4 things we have to discuss just around this one moment in the book. Firstly, I applaud how carefully Nikabrik is drawn as a character throughout the entire book. We talked last time about the difference between good and evil, in some sense being the difference between kind of principle and pragmatism, right? Do you do the right thing for the right reason, or do you do the right thing for the wrong reason? Like, what is your moral orientation in terms of the action that you take? Nikabrik has been presented from the jump as a pragmatist, a kind of self-regarding pragmatist, a hero to his people. Well, we can speculate about his heroism. Certainly a defender of his people, right? He believes that the dwarves have been oppressed. He believes that the dwarves have had a tougher go of it in Narnia than any of the other races, any of the other kinds of being in Narnia. So he wants to ensure that they are protected. He's not an outright villain in the sense that he is seeking to, receive personal acclaim, right? He doesn't think that returning the White Witch to life, if indeed that is even possible, would bring him personal wealth and riches and power. I mean, maybe he does, but certainly that's not the argument that he's making, right? He's making the argument instead that this is the pragmatic response to the threat of the Telmarine army. The Telmarines are going to wipe out the old Narnians. Now that the old Narnians have been roused from hiding by, let me check my notes here, oh yeah, Prince Caspian, now that their concealment has been removed, they are vulnerable. And the only response to this, the only practical response to this, as Nikabrik is voicing this, right? I'm not really defending him here. I'm just observing how neatly and consistently this character is drawn. Now, of course, he's pairing himself with a hag and with a werewolf two creatures, well, one creature which we've already learned would not be welcome in Aslan's army, right? We learned this from Truffle Hunter back when Prince Caspian is on his little his glad-handing recruitment tour of Narnia, that the hag would not be welcome in Aslan's army. And Trumpkin, too, opposes the inclusion of the hag at a fundamental level, right? There are evil creatures in Narnia. We know this to be true. And we can assume, I mean, from the description of his voice, if nothing else, that the werewolf belongs to that same latter category. But the real question is this. What happened to the children as they were trying to get to Aslan's How? The interruption by Aslan, the appearance, the offered guidance, right, the potential guidance of Aslan to the Pevensey children as they're crossing on that first night would have led them, we can only infer, to Aslan's How earlier than this, appearance at dawn. Would that have been a good thing or a bad thing? And if it would have been a bad thing, then what are we to understand about Aslan's appearance to Lucy that first night anyway, and the subsequent trip down the gorge because the other kids didn't believe her, or, Peter and Susan didn't believe her, and Edmund voted with the pack, as it were. Because had they arrived earlier, we can be pretty sure Nikabrik would not have been ready to unfurl his plan. He doesn't know that they are there. This is occurring in phenomenological time, right? And these two strands of story are now crossing for the first time at a point at which the real complexity of the second story is revealed, right? Peter and Edmund are able to overhear this entire conversation at a crisis point, at a turning point in that other story. And if they had arrived earlier, it wouldn't have happened. 5 minutes before this, right? There's no way that Caspian and Cornelius and Truffle Hunter are suspicious of Nikabrik's intent, or at least not, willing to draw steel on Nikabrik when he leads a hag and a werewolf into their company, right? We understand it's dark inside, and maybe their true identities are not evident, but still, Nikabrik is bringing friends into the inner sanctum, into their chamber here. Had they arrived earlier, had Peter and Edmund arrived earlier, it's entirely possible that Nikabrik just would not have revealed his intention to Caspian, that he would not have, presented the plan in quite this way, would perhaps have pursued it in more clandestine ways, and if he had done so, may well have been successful, right? He's presenting it here as a pragmatic argument, but had the High King... this is a line of speculation that we can only kind of engage in for so long, because we simply don't know how Nikabrik would have reacted if he had the confirmation that the horn had been successful, that it had fulfilled its purpose, and it had in fact summoned help. Would he have been as skeptical of the High King Peter and King Edmund as Trumpkin had been? I mean, probably, right? If not more so. We know that the Black Dwarves were even more skeptical than the Red Dwarves when Caspian was doing his recruitment tour. So it's difficult to say, but I find it interesting because it is the kind of thing that in the pages of J.R.R. Tolkien's work would be recognized as eucatastrophe. They didn't believe Lucy. They went down the gorge. They wasted a whole day, and now they are arriving at the exact perfect moment where not only can they hear the entire plan as it is laid out by the villains of the piece, but also intervene at exactly the right moment necessary to save Caspian. That is what happens here. But we're supposed to believe that this is, I think within the pages of the Narniad, a less satisfactory outcome, right? That something bad happened, that the Pevensey children should have followed Lucy at that first opportunity, that was the right path. And instead they strayed from the path and then came back to the path. And that's good, it's better than the alternative, but that something was lost, that some opportunity was missing here. And that's difficult to reconcile with the fact that this actually plays out about as well as it possibly could for our heroes. That, I think, is going to do it here. The other thing I will note as well, just as a point of speculation here, is that because of this delay, our heroes do arrive at dawn, which perhaps wouldn't be terribly significant, except for the fact that Dr. Cornelius previously said that dawn is a good time to work white magic, that dawn is a particularly special and effective time to work white magic. That then isn't played out in the blowing of the horn because of the attack of Miraz's forces, but it is played out in the fortuitous arrival, the eucatastrophic arrival of Peter and Edmund right here at Aslan's How. And if I'm using that word eucatastrophe and it's unfamiliar to you, I invite you to return next week to Stars and Swords, when we begin our discussion of Professor Tolkien's The Silmarillion and really dig deep into the underlying cosmology of Middle-earth. I can't wait, and I can't get distracted by it now because we still have to finish up with Caspian, and we're going to do so by looking at our first slide from chapter 13 here, Peter making the challenge to Miraz. And while the doctor spread out the parchment and opened his inkhorn and sharpened his pen, Peter leant back with half-closed eyes and recalled to his mind the language in which he had written such things long ago in Narnia's golden age. "Right," he said at last. "And now, if you're ready, Doctor." Dr. Cornelius dipped his pen and waited. Peter dictated as follows. "Peter, by the gifts of Aslan, by election, by prescription, and by conquest, High King over all kings in Narnia, Emperor of the Lone Islands, and Lord of Cair Paravel, Knight of the most noble Order of the Lion, to Miraz, son of Caspian the Eighth, sometime Lord Protector of Narnia, and now styling himself King of Narnia, greeting." Have you got that? "Narnia, greeting," muttered the doctor. "Yes, sire." Again, a recognition that there is a Narnian Peter and there is a Peter Pevensey, and those two are overlapping, right? There is a Venn diagram of identity here, but sometimes he has to reach for it. Sometimes he has to stretch for it. Sometimes he has to remember the skills that he learned and the form of language which came, it would seem, so naturally to him at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Sometimes he has to recall it to mind. I think it's extremely powerful here. And this is also where Peter signs off. Given at our lodging at Aslan's Howe this 12th day of the month, green roof in the first year, Caspian 10th of Narnia, which is helpful because it gives us the month, it gives us the day of the month, so that we can backfill a convenient understanding of the timeline of this book. It's also a little presumptuous, right? Because this is, if he wins, then it will be the first year of Caspian the 10th of Narnia. But right now, there is no Caspian the 10th of Narnia. There is a guy who is heir to the throne, and that is that. We are not, in fact, going to crown him for another 6 days, right? Because we have this day, and then we have the following day when the messages are sent out. And 5 days later, they gather at Baruna for the final confrontation with the Telmarines. So it's, 6 days yet before Caspian the 10th will be crowned. So there's a kind of a loose, I was going to say a loose understanding, but I don't think that's fair because Lewis, medievalist as he was, there's no way he had a loose understanding of how feudal titles work. There is a slightly simplified understanding of how royalty works in Narnia, right? A high king rules over the other kings, but those other high kings don't seem to have specific domains. We do get that Edmund is the Duke of the Lantern Waste, right? That's part of his introduction later. But that would make him a duke. You guys, you're only the title of the highest title that you hold, right? I don't know. It's a little confounding. It's a little confusing, and it's certainly a little strange that Caspian is referred to throughout as the king rather than Prince, as he still is. Rightful King Caspian, right? King-elect Caspian, perhaps. But not yet king. So Peter selects his envoys to go off to the Telmarines. And from here, I'm going to skip over a lot of what happens in chapter 13, because really all that we're doing is setting up two perspectives on two opposing forces and kind of detailing the ways in which they are opposed, detailing the ways in which they are different from one another, and kind of celebrating the one while condemning the other. Mostly, I will say, through a kind of skillful implication. We're not really drawing out too much of, the Telmarines are terrible, and the Telmarine lords, when we get to meet them, are cruelly kicking puppies and setting fire to books. Right? We're not quite that harsh. It's a softer and more sinister kind of depiction of their villainy. We'll get to all of that as we move through the chapter. And I guess the thing that I want to call out here is again, this sense of the proper order of things, right? Peter is absolutely following not just the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law. He is doing things as a king should. He's honoring the request of the eldest of the Bulgy Bears, right? To act as marshal, as was his right in days of yore, right? He doesn't even understand why anyone remembers that was the Bulgy Bears' right back then. But the Bulgy Bear remembers, and so Peter honors it. He too recalls that is the right way of doing things. He refuses to allow Reepicheep to act as marshal, even though Reepicheep is the most courtly of all the talking animals, right? He refuses to allow Reepicheep to act as a marshal because of the possibility that it would frighten Miraz and therefore give Peter an unfair advantage on the field. He is all about doing things in the right way. Whereas over on the Telmarine side of things, well, we're getting our two shady lords tricking Miraz into accepting this challenge of a duel so that they themselves can then betray the parley, right? Betray the peace around the duel, attack Caspian's forces, defeat him, and take charge of Narnia themselves. And there's even within that, an enfolded betrayal, because one of the reasons that they're so mad at Miraz is that he is not honoring his feudal responsibilities as king. He is taking and taking from this land and not sharing the wealth, right? So in every sense, the Telmarine force is riddled with a selfishness, a corruption, a lack of loyalty and proper fealty, and a lack of respect for the proper way of doing things, a lack of respect for decency and dignity, whereas Peter is embodying quietly all of those things. We'll also note, I suppose, too, that as Miraz is tricked by his followers, by his lords, who are playing on his insecurities and his fear, right? Specifically his fear. Peter simultaneously refuses during the duel to give in to that same kind of fear and respond with aggression, right? He's very considered. When Miraz falls through no fault of Peter's own, he steps back and waits for his opponent to rise. He doesn't even take that advantage that is presented to him in that moment, despite the fact that the battle is harder than he thought. We're skipping ahead here. I want to get to chapter 14 now. At the beginning of the chapter, we see the marshalling at the lists prepared for the duel, and then we pull out to see kind of both sides of the story. We see the trees crashing down on the enemy, much like the ants, of course, in the Two Towers. And this brings us to the reason for tonight's title, Making Good on Macbeth, because both Lewis and Tolkien were frustrated by the prophecy in Macbeth about Birnam Wood coming to Dunsinane, right? Which turns out to be just a kind of simplistic and venal bit of military trickery, right? It is just a little bit of we'll hold branches and that will disguise our force as it approaches Dunsinane. Hell no, says Tolkien. Hell no, says Lewis. Let's do this properly. So we have the version of the ants taking Isengard in the Two Towers, which we will crucially note has not yet been published. It is likely, I think, that Lewis understood that this was something that Tolkien was doing. It is likely that he had at least seen sketches of the idea, if not the finished manuscript for that part of the book. It is possible that the two of them had discussed it, but nonetheless, The Lord of the Rings does not come out for, 4 years. The Two Towers does not come out for 4 years after Prince Caspian. So that's the separation there, in case you're wondering who got there first. The other side of this development, I should note, is perhaps the most convincing argument that Michael Ward, who I previously mentioned, makes in his book Planet Narnia about the influence of Mars over Prince Caspian as a novel. Because, as I said, Mars has two aspects. It has the martial aspect. It has, Mars and Ares, right? The warlike aspect, but also this sylvan aspect, this arboreal aspect. So the rise of a forest into combat as an army is actually a pretty compelling take on both sides of Mars as a direct influence over the pages of Prince Caspian. So we're not going to look in depth at the duel between Peter and Miraz because mostly it's just a well done fight sequence. It's just kind of a good boys' own action adventure fight scene, and I suppose it's interesting that we're mediating out our perspective on it, that we're not in Peter's POV as this thing is unfolding, but rather he is elevated as our chosen champion. He is our archetype, our avatar, in this battle. So we are left with Edmund and Cornelius kind of giving us the blow-by-blow account here of what's happening in this match. As I mentioned, Peter does not give in to an anger or a fear in response to the heckling of the Telmarine spectators, I suppose would be the appropriate word here. And he doesn't take advantage of Miraz's stumble, right? When he falls over the little tussock of grass, it is not Peter who capitalizes on this mistake. It is vulture-like the Telmarine lords who firstly proclaim treachery on the side of the Narnians, a false claim of treachery on the side of the Narnians, and then charge the field, murdering King Miraz right there on the field. Evil, say it with me, is ultimately self-defeating. If you are a bad guy in fantasy fiction, ultimately you will be undone by your own badness. It's just the way that it goes. It does leave, luckily, our teenage hero here without too much blood on his hands. The trees attack, the Telmarines break and run for the bridge at Baruna, but then we cut away to show what happened to the bridge at Baruna. Let's catch up with Aslan, with Susan, and with Lucy here. It would help if I showed you the slide, I guess. And by so doing, show myself the slide. They turned a little to the right, raced down a steep hill, and found the long bridge of Baruna in front of them. Before they had begun to cross it, however, up out of the water came a great, wet, bearded head, larger than a man's, crowned with rushes. It looked at Aslan, and out of its mouth a deep voice came. "Hail, Lord," it said. "Loose my chains." "Who on earth is that?" whispered Susan. "I think it's the river god. But hush," said Lucy. "Bacchus," said Aslan. "Deliver him from his chains." "That means the bridge, I expect," thought Lucy. And so it did. Bacchus and his people splashed forward into the shallow water, and a minute later the most curious things began happening. Great, strong trunks of ivy came curling up all the piers of the bridge, growing as quickly as fire grows, wrapping the stones round, splitting, breaking, separating them. The walls of the bridge turned into hedges, gay with hawthorn, for a moment, and then disappeared as the whole thing with a rush and a rumble collapsed into the swirling water. With much splashing, screaming, and laughter, the revellers waded or swam or danced across the ford. "Hurrah, it's the ford of Baruna again now," cried the girls, and up the bank on the far side and into the town. A restoration fantasy, indeed, right? We use the power of fantasy narratives to make the world the way it ought to be, to make the world the way it was, crucially, right? The industrial work of the Telmarines, industrial is too much, the urban work, right? The modern work of the Telmarines here being forcibly undone by the river god, awoken by Aslan's roar. Would the river god have emerged at this point had Aslan not given that roar? Had we not given the description of the roar rolling forth across all of Narnia and waking all of these ancient forces? Probably not. Presumably not. Presumably the river god is not just hanging out there, right? And you'll note here too, Aslan mediating. He himself does not destroy the bridge. He doesn't order the destruction of the bridge to come from the talking animals, right? To come from some kind of explicitly Aslanic Narnian force or capability. Instead, it's Bacchus. It's something ancient meeting with something ancient, destroying something modern, right? He's kind of playing by the rules of this encounter in a way. He's meeting the river god, the great bearded, weeded river god, exactly where he is. And we have a pair of sequences moving forward which kind of conform, on the one hand, to the same kind of restoration fantasy, right? The idea of a restoration fantasy, swiftly, is that the world was ordered and was then entered into a state of disorder forcibly and is now being restored to that previous order. Nothing new is happening. We're not making things better. We're putting things back where we found them. Thank you very much. That is absolutely what is happening here. Largely at least. We'll talk about how Narnia is going to be transformed right at the end of tonight's reading. But here, as we move through the town of Baruna, this modern town of Baruna, we get a couple of examples of this, right? We get Gwendolyn, the schoolgirl, escaping from the malign influence, the dictatorial influence of Miss Prizzle. We get the boy who is being beaten by his father. His father is transformed into a tree, and the boy runs off laughing with Aslan's forces. And then the girl who is teaching math to these porcine young men, also finally escaping. And then ultimately, the discovery and the restoration, and again, another explicit restoration of Caspian's old nurse, of the spark that lighted the fire of rebellion, if I can borrow from an entirely separate and distinct intellectual property. Systematically, then, we're opposing that which is too tight, that which is too strict, that which is too ordered, right? From the clothes that the school children are wearing, that Gwendolyn is wearing, to strict teachers like Miss Prizzle. We're bringing this, we're opposing, thankfully, right, pretty comprehensively domestic violence. I'm glad that we can stand against that. But there's even there, right? It's a kind of order. It's a kind of misuse of order. It's a misuse of authority. Authority here is being turned to darkness. It is being turned to oppression. There's nothing wrong, Narnia would like us to believe and understand very clearly, with authority, right? Authority is what lets Aslan be Aslan. It's what lets Peter be Peter. But there is a bad kind of authority. There is a misused kind of authority. And that's what we're being liberated from here, kind of, we can piece these things together. When you get a series of events here that all seem to be like thematically connected, you can really start working out a schematic. You can start working out diagrammatically what is happening morally in the book. What are we supposed to take from this? But what we're getting, I think, is something more specific than just the throwing off of shackles. It's something more than just authority being put to ill use. That's certainly true in the case of the teacher, right? This is a bad teacher who is dominant over her class in a way that you ought not to be dominant over your class. And then we have the father, beating the boy. That is a misuse of authority. It is a misuse of power over another. But what about the girl? The girl, crucially, right, who is in the company of the boys. She's trying to teach them arithmetic. She's trying to teach them elementary math, and they are making her life extremely difficult. There's not really an abuse of authority there, unless from a modern perspective, we might be able to step back and say, well, you see, the authority that is being abused there is the privilege of masculinity in a world that values masculinity, in a misogynistic world that devalues femininity, right? But I don't think for a second that Lewis is leaning into that kind of reading at all. And had he done so, he would have been anticipating movements in social culture and in political thought by, 50 years or more. I think that instead what we're seeing here is the underlying trait which defines badness, defines evilness, defines the dark path in Narnia. And we've already discussed it this evening, because what we're talking about is fear, right? We're talking about the fear that Susan felt. We're talking about the fear that works on Miraz, the fear that Peter explicitly avoids invoking when he refuses to allow Reepicheep to join the lists and to act as a marshal at the duel. Fear is the tool of the enemy in Narnia. And I want to go back here, all the way back to chapter 11, in fact. Yes, here we are. "Hush," said the other four, and now Aslan stopped and turned and stood facing them, looking so majestic that they felt as glad as anyone can who feels afraid, and as afraid as anyone can who feels glad. The boys strode forward. Lucy made way for them. Susan and the dwarf shrank back. "Oh, Aslan," said King Peter, dropping to one knee and raising the lion's heavy paw to his face. "I'm so glad, and I'm so sorry. I've been leading them wrong ever since we started, and especially yesterday morning," right? So I slipped this out of the beginning of the scene that we discussed earlier. This is when Aslan acknowledges that Susan has been feeling fear and then begins to restore her. But we're not just acknowledging that fear is bad here. We are absolutely acknowledging that fear is bad here. Susan and the dwarf shrank back. Why did they shrink back? Because they're still afraid, because they're still living in a state of fear, and cannot therefore embrace the opposite, which is presented to us in as neat and tight and tidy a moral schematic as C.S. Lewis is ever going to give us. The opposite of fear is gladness. The two exist in a balance. You feel as glad as anyone can who feels afraid, and as afraid as anyone can who feels glad. Gladness here is Lucy in Narnia, right? It's the joy of discovery. It's her going out into the moonlit glade and seeing the trees. There's almost a sense of gladness there, of joy, right? Gladness is perhaps to the modern ear maybe a little too simple, a little too superficial, but there's a joy. There is a connectedness. There is an absence of fear. Fear is what gets you. And I think that this is just so completely important all the way through the books. I must move on, because we're running for such a terribly long time, and I'm now approaching a moment that I thought I would never get to, which is my hard out for this recording session. So please forgive me if we're going to skip over this, but you're all smart people. I'm sure that you can infer more from what I'm saying, and that you can find applicability within the pages of this book. You can find numerous instances of people being afraid or not afraid, right? Think of the escape of Gwendolyn, right? She is afraid of the tyrannical teacher. That is what gives the teacher her power. Yes, she is empowered by authority, but it is the fear that keeps Gwendolyn in line. It is the fear that keeps the children. It is the fear that keeps the talking animals, the old Narnians, hiding and shrouded away in Archenland and in hidden places within Narnia itself. It is fear that gives the abusive father power over his son. It is fear that keeps the girl, the math teacher, with the boys, right? She is surrounded by 4 porcine boys, all of whom we're told disappear, and the country thereafter has extremely good pigs. So Aslan's magic can be extremely subtle when it wants to be, but it is fear that is keeping her there, right? And it is fear that keeps the nurse in her state of decrepitude that is also restored by Aslan's presence. Fear of death, fear of what has happened to Caspian, fear of what has happened to the tales of old Narnia. All of these things, right? Certainly her daughter, her granddaughter, the young girl that Aslan meets at the beginning of that section, is also feeling fear, right? Is begging Aslan for his help. Fear is what gets you. Fear is what stops Susan from hearing Lucy the first time that Lucy says that she saw Aslan. Susan says that clearly. Aslan acknowledges it here. This is our, not exactly a moral spectrum, right? Not exactly a comprehensive moral diagram for everything that you can feel while you are in Narnia, but certainly a powerful acknowledgement that fear is the thing that will keep you down and will keep you separated from gladness, right? You feel as much gladness as you can for all the fear that you feel. That's how it works. It is a scale. The less fear, the more gladness there will be in your life, which we'll note too, I think, is also kind of an adult perspective, right? Because children are obviously afraid, but the fear of a child is a simple and fleeting thing. The fear of an adult is a much more complex, roiling, boiling, deep and tangled kind of thing, right? I'm reminded of my Robert Burns, who's coming up so early, right? In his poem To a Mouse, he comments that the mouse is lucky because the mouse only ever exists in the present, and the calamity of his coulthard, his pitchblade kind of crashing through the walls of the mouse's house, that is a terrible thing to happen, but it is just a fleeting instant, and that is the mouse's blessing. Because he can look back and he can look forward. The human, the Burns himself as poet, can look back and look forward and feel regret and feel the fear. If you haven't read your Burns lately, I can highly recommend it. His Burns Night is coming up here in the middle of January, so definitely go and grab a volume. You will recognize at least some of his poetry, even if you've never read all of Burns's poetry. But the Poet Laureate of Scotland was a very fine poet indeed. Maybe I'll do a little thing over on the Patreon for Burns Night. Maybe I'll give a little reading for Burns Night over on the Patreon, and you guys can join me there. And we'll maybe drink a glass of whiskey, maybe eat a little haggis, and maybe enjoy some fine poetry from Scotland's most favourite son. We really must push on here. So into then chapter 15. Aslan finally meets Caspian, you guys. So that's a thing that happens here in the very last chapter of our book. Let me advance here. This is actually Reepicheep's tale. This is, yes, of course. So Aslan meets with Caspian. He's interrupted by the arrival of Reepicheep, who has had a hard time in the battle. Lucy restores him with the elixir, but not, crucially, completely. I'm, in the interest of expedience, not going to read this entire thing, which is going to pain me because I so deeply love Reepicheep. But here in all of his courtliness, he is making exactly the argument that we were making earlier about dignity, right? That there is a proper way of doing things, that he is a mouse of the tail, and the mouse's tail is, in some sense, the repository of the mouse's identity. It is the right thing for a mouse to possess a tail. And ultimately, of course, we're going to tangle this notion of dignity and decency and the right way of doing things into the restoration fantasy, because in a sense, any notion you have of a right way of doing things, particularly a right way of doing things which you understand because that was how you were taught, or because that was how it used to be done, or you can look back at a time when things were better, a time when things were done properly, then of course you're inevitably simply acknowledging a right way of doing things in the context of that kind of understanding of the progress of history is going to bring you to a point where you're engaging in restoration fantasy. Justice here is restored. Reepicheep here is restored, right? And then we're enfolding all of these other social structures into the restoration of Narnia, right? Caspian is first knighted and then turns and knights all of the other people, all the other members of his inner circle. All of the prisoners are taken away to Baruna, where we note that they are fed beef there and beer too, right? We are treating our prisoners decently. The messengers are sent out for all the other Telmarines in Narnia to come to Baruna, where a final dispensation will be made, a final offer will be made, a final peace will be bargained for. And then we have another feast, of course. Let's skip ahead to the end of the feast, because this is genuinely lovely, genuinely evocative, and as I mentioned earlier, like a little hard to pin down symbolically, but no less rich for that. This is the end of the Feast of Celebration after the battle has been won. The best thing of all about this feast was that there was no breaking up or going away, but as the talk grew quieter and slower, one after another would begin to nod and finally drop off to sleep with feet toward the fire and good friends on either side, till at last there was a silence all round the circle, and the chattering of water over stone at the ford of Baruna could be heard once more. But all night Aslan and the moon gazed upon each other with joyful and unblinking eyes. I am inclined to read this as a meeting of the masculine and the absent feminine force from Narnia. I think that that is a really interesting and provocative perspective. It's textually a little insubstantial, right? But certainly we can talk about the significance of the moon as a guiding force for Lucy. The moon is first obscured, but through the moon's light, she can find her way to the glade. Then the moon is clear, and now the moon is not only present, but connected to Aslan, right? There is a meeting of minds here. And we should all, I think, here in these dark days, have this experience of camaraderie and fellowship, right? Not even, and this is so beautifully evocative of Lewis, right? To acknowledge that even in great parties, there is that bittersweet moment when the party starts to wind down, when people are kind of breaking off. That moment of recognition that something great is over is also a sadness, right? It can be a bittersweet kind of beautiful sadness. It can be haunting for sure, but it's also, yeah, it is a darkness there, even in the brightest light of joy and companionship. But here we avoid even that, right? There is no bittersweet leaving. There is no separation right now. There is just this companionable slipping to sleep and everyone staying together, everyone staying whole, and the restoration of the world beyond that, right? The waters running over the ford of Baruna. It's really lovely. We must, I guess, acknowledge, if not all but skip over, the final beat here in our understanding of the Telmarines, that the Telmarines are human, that they come, in fact, from Earth, that there is a story of pirates in the South Sea who take to an island, who absolutely, colonize in the worst and most aggressive way possible the indigenous inhabitants of that island. And then a splinter faction flees off up into the mountains, finds a chink, a gap, a space between the worlds as used to be and still is, although less common now, and slips into Narnia. They become the population of Telmar, this time crucially without conquest, right? There is no kind of imperial conquest of Telmar because Telmar has already been denuded of its resident inhabitants. We don't know why, and Aslan conspicuously does not tell us. Space for speculation here, all that you like. If there is indeed an ordered way to the world, if indeed the world is underpinned by a fundamental goodness, perhaps Telmar was made as a space for this population so that things can unfold as they should. We might speculate that that is true, particularly according to Lewis's cosmology, right? And then there is a famine in Telmar. The Telmarines come to Narnia. That is it. This is the invading force. But they really are authentically sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. They really are human beings, which puts them into that special category of being, just like the Pevensey kids. And I do think it's crucial to call out here that it really is the same class of being. There is no functional distinction between Caspian and Peter, right? For all that Peter is the high, except, crucially, right? I casually fell into the one instance where there is actually a distinction between the two. There is no functional distinction between Caspian and Edmund, right? They are going to be kings of equal rank. The other Telmarines are also human. They are also capable of the goodness and the badness of human beings. Human beings absolutely belonging to one of those categories of beings which can be both good and evil. Some of the Telmarines don't want to live in Narnia, though crucially some do. You'll note that the younger Telmarines who have heard the stories of the old ways do want to stay. And God, it's hard not to think of Lewis looking at the new generation, right, in the middle of the 20th century. It's hard not to think of him looking at the rise of the teenager as a sociological phenomenon, right? The thing that will lead to social change and revolution in the 1960s happening right now on his doorstep. It's hard not to draw those connections when you think about the younger Telmarines are more likely to stay because they have heard the old stories. Like, where did those old stories come from? They must have been passed down from the older Telmarines, but they have been calloused by age, right? There's no reason to believe that the older Telmarines, when they were young, were not exposed to the same stories. That would kind of suggest that there's an entirely separate and distinct and new conduit for those tales to the younger generation of Telmarines. It seems more likely that the older minds have become calloused and hardened and are not so open to wonder, right? And when you think back through the pages of this book and you think about all the many times that grown-up is used as, God, a borderline slur in some cases, right? That grown-up is absolutely an insult and to be childlike, to be possessed of all of that kind of wonder and openness and naivete and capacity for additional wonder, right? Capacity for additional faith, too. That these are generally heralded as good things, not just because Lewis is targeting this at a juvenile readership, but certainly partly because he's targeting this at a juvenile readership. But that adulthood, that being a grown-up, is a condition of reduced wonder, right? With the sole exception of the professor, as we noted in the first book, that he is a special category of grown-up, at least back on Earth. We'll have the opportunity to talk more about grown-ups coming into Narnia in the future, of course. And then we'll frame this out very quickly. Aslan creates a magical portal which will allow everyone present to return to Earth. Reepicheep valiantly volunteers to lead his mice through, only to be told that he cannot do that, for on the other side of the portal, his kind would be shown in a fair. No more terrible fate than that. And so the Pevensey children volunteer to lead the way. They change back into their school clothes. And are mocked even now by some of the older Talmarines, right? Some of the older Talmarines are still creating friction, still creating dissent and discord in Narnia, which is why they are leaving, right? They're being safely sent back to Earth. They are choosing not to remain because the future here, we can infer, will be better than the past. And so they step back through. The Pevensey children lead the others back through the portal, and we get this. After that came a moment which is hard to describe, for the children seemed to be seeing three things at once. One was the mouth of a cave opening into the glaring green and blue of an island in the Pacific, where all the Talmarines would find themselves the moment they were through the door. The second was a glade in Narnia, the faces of dwarfs and beasts, the deep eyes of Aslan, and the white patches on the badger's cheeks. But the third, which rapidly swallowed up the other two, was the grey, gravelly surface of a platform in a country station, and a seat with luggage round it, where they were all sitting as if they had never moved from it. A little flat and dreary for a moment after all they'd been through, but also, unexpectedly, nice in its own way, what with the familiar railway smell and the English sky and the summer term before them. "Well," said Peter, "we have had a time." "Bother," said Edmund, "I've left my new torch in Narnia." The end, and thus the curtain falls. And I know that I am conspicuously not talking about perhaps the most heartbreaking sequence here at the end of the book, right? I am avoiding talking about it because really it just conspires to present us with the sense that this is an ongoing series at this point, right? There is no... One of the reasons that the end of Prince Caspian might feel a little swift, might feel a little hollow, might feel a little insubstantial, might feel a little temporary, is that it's temporary. It's avowedly temporary, right? We have already now framed this out as a series. Peter's discussion earlier about the fact that he and Susan will not return to Narnia, that they are too old, and that actually that is okay for reasons which will become clear to you down the line. This is also implying that this series will continue. So we don't have to end Prince Caspian with the same... grandeur, right, with which we ended The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe really ends as though it is kind of an open-ended final word, for sure, but a kind of final word. And there's no need to do that here. So instead, we pivot, right? We have this de-escalating maneuver here from Lewis, bringing it all back down to an, "Oh, Edmund," kind of joke, right? "Bother, I left my new torch in Narnia." Yeah, did the narrative forget about this too? Did Edmund forget? Did Lewis forget? Where at some point did that torch disappear? I wonder if we can go back and... flashlight, sorry, for my American cousins here. A flashlight was misplaced in Narnia. It's a joke. It's a de-escalating move. It's a deflationary move here to bring us back down with a kind of a wry return to normality. As you can see here, right, there's none of that... Again, kind of bittersweet ending to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because we step through here, right? It's momentarily flat and dreary, but then also unexpectedly nice in its way, with familiar railway smell and the English sky and the summer term before them. The summer term that was so ominous earlier in the book is now kind of a pleasant prospect, because we've matured, because we've grown up, because in this book that is itself more adult than the preceding novel, we have expanded to fill that space. As our faith has grown, as Aslan has grown, so our own sense of our own capacity and capability has grown, right? None of the kids here have a real heavy turning point, emotionally speaking, except for Susan, right? Susan is aware that fear was holding her back, and we can only hope that she will carry that with her. If there is something to condemn the end of Prince Caspian for, I think it is exactly and explicitly that, right? What happens to Susan from this point on is negligible on the one hand, right? Almost nothing happens to Susan from this point on, but what we get is extremely bad. And I'm not a big fan of what happens to Susan. And I know that Lewis had plans to perhaps address what happened to Susan, but unfortunately died before he could realize those plans. But still, nonetheless, it's a shame that Susan, who has the real emotional arc in this book, who is the one who most directly addresses her fear, doesn't then get a greater catharsis. And that takes us almost completely to ours. That takes us to the end of Prince Caspian, the second/4th book in the Narniad. And I hope you'll join me the next holiday season as we look at The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the 3rd/5th book in the Narniad, and get to look at that in the same kind of depth and detail. This has been a ton of fun. It's been such a nice little interregnum, right? Poised between Dracula on the one hand and our next project. More about that in just a moment. It's been nice just to take a few weeks over the holiday period and to dive into Lewis, who is just such a magical writer, who is just so capable of giving us these haunting moments. I must admit, coming into Caspian, I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I have. I didn't expect it to be as complete. I had like the idea, right? The initial kind of layperson's understanding of Caspian. Oh, it's a little bit more grown up than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but really it's just the second book in a series. That's really the pivot. That's the turning point that we see here, is that now he's aware that he's writing serialized fiction in a more, I don't know, conscious way than he was in the pages of the first book. And that is true. But for me, there is something just much more ambitious laying just under the surface. I think I mentioned that back in the first unit. The word that comes to mind here is ambitious for what Lewis is undertaking here. And we see that, I think, metaphorically, right? We see it in terms of the allegory, if indeed allegory it is. We see it in terms of the metaphor. We see it in terms of the symbolism. But we also see it in terms of the emotional palette. We see it in terms of what he's willing to undertake as a writer. There are some really nice pieces of fictional positioning, of narrative positioning in this book. I think of, Peter and Edmund being outside Caspian's inner council and hearing that relayed, right? With for the first time, Trumpkin acting as the narrative voice, interceding in parentheticals to give us more information, to kind of give us a kind of dynamism, an internal dynamism and reflexivity to that whole part. I will forever be haunted by Aslan looking at the moon. I think that is maybe my personal favorite Aslan moment now. I think that is the one that will stick with me moving forward through the works of C.S. Lewis. As I say, next holiday season, I have no dates for you. I have no plan for you. I haven't read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader in 20 years. So I can say no more than we will look at it probably sometime around the middle of December next year, and we'll see how that breaks down. I remember it being a fairly breezy read, even compared to Caspian, so maybe we won't spend too much time on it, or much more time than the 3 sessions we spent on Caspian. I am still talking somehow, impossibly, after almost 2 hours. We must, before we wrap up, talk about what comes next, because I'm really excited, you guys, and we are going to be talking about the Silmarillion. This is a really ambitious undertaking, and so we are going to give it a proper amount of time. But I also don't want to fall into the trap of reading the Silmarillion too closely or too pedantically. I want to appreciate it as it was written, not as a complete and comprehensive glossary for every single thing that's in the Lord of the Rings and the expanded legendarium, right? As a Rosetta Stone to understand all Tolkienalia. I don't want to read it simply as appendix material for other stories. I want to read it as a book. I want to read it as a story. I want to read it in that medieval narrative mode that we discussed last week. That's where Tolkien and Lewis kind of come from differing perspectives in terms of their literary output. Tolkien writes this as an historian. That is what it is intended to be. It is supposed to be an in-fiction accounting of the deepest history of Middle-earth, and I kind of want to read it. Obviously, we're going to look at its writing, at its authorship, at its connections to the other works. Of course, that's inevitable, and it would be denying us some opportunities for really great conversation at the same time. But I don't just want it to be a series of very pedantic footnotes. I want it to feel, even as we're moving through it together, like a story. And part of that is making it as accessible as possible. Obviously, if you've listened to me even just in tonight's session, you'll know that I'm a big fan of Tolkien. I have studied extensively his works, and he is my favorite author. And there's only so much kind of naive enthusiasm that I can bring to the project of reading the Silmarillion. I bring a great deal of informed enthusiasm, but I cannot fake a naivete. But I do want to keep this series accessible. I do want to allow it to be your first exposure to the Silmarillion, and hopefully even possibly your first exposure to Tolkien works in general. If you have just seen the Lord of the Rings movies, that's probably going to be sufficient. You're probably going to have a sense of where we're going as we move through this discussion. I want to keep it buoyant in that way and not get too bogged down in the details. So that has led me to basically break the entire book down into 20 sessions. It's going to be a 20-week enterprise, by which I mean it's probably going to be 24 or 25 weeks, given my propensity for overrunning these things. But it also means that we are going to look at the first part of the Silmarillion. We're going to look at the creation myth of the elves, the Ainulindale, right? The song itself. We're going to look at that in a single week. We're going to look at the Valaquenta in a single week. And then we're going to look at, between 1 and 2 chapters per week, basically, to get through the entirety of the book. It's not a particularly thick volume, is the thing. So, hopefully that will give us the right combination of depth, but also accessibility, because my real goal is to make you as excited about Tolkien as I am. That's what I'm going to try to do over the course of the next 20 weeks. And then I promise we're going to do something a little more modern. We're going to do something a little more, a little more avowedly feminist. We're going to take on maybe some female writers. I'd love to do some trans writers in the speculative fiction space. I know we've spent an unexpectedly large amount of time dealing with, dead white writers, but dead white men in particular. But this is going to be something special, and I hope that you are as excited to start as I am. As I say, next week, January 9th, I'm going to be giving a probably 45-minute lecture on the roots of the Silmarillion as a book, why it was written, where it came from, how it was collated, when it was published, the whole kind of evolution of this as an artifact, as a piece of literary work and literary accomplishment and academic work too, right? To show proper respect to Christopher Tolkien and the huge amount of work that he did, not just in preservation of his father's legacy, but in the creation of this considered perspective on Tolkien's entire legendarium. And then, as I say, January 16th, we begin with the Ainulindale. That's going to be a 2-hour show. There's basically no way that it's not, and I hope that you are as excited for it as I am. And since I just crossed 2 hours on this recording, I think we're probably going to be done. Guys, thank you so much for joining me here at the beginning of a brand new year. Let us resolve to make this year as good as we can. Let us resolve never to give in to fear. Let us resolve to always look for gladness, for hope, for joy in the world around us. And where we cannot find it, to perhaps do what we can to make more of it ourselves. Thank you so much for joining me. I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, take care. Good night, guys.